The sun had barely risen over the Zimbabwe savanna when the herd began to move. Dust particles caught the golden morning light as 30 elephants walked in their ancient formation matriarchs leading calves tucked safely between protective adults, their massive footsteps creating a rhythm that had echoed across these plains for millennia. But one small figure remained motionless in the tall grass behind them. The newborn weighed only 90 pounds, dangerously underweight for an elephant calf. His mother had labored through the night, her body struggling with the premature delivery. When he finally emerged into the world, she stood over him for several long minutes, her trunk exploring his tiny frame with what seemed like hesitation rather than recognition. Then she turned and walked away. The herd followed her without looking back. Their survival instincts, honed over thousands of generations, told them what human observers find heartbreaking: to witness a calf this small born this week would slow the herd's movement and attract predators. In the harsh calculus of elephant survival, the health of the many outweighs the life of one fragile newborn. The calf stood alone in the vastness of the Griquitland. His legs trembled with exhaustion from the effort of simply remaining upright. His trunk, still unfamiliar and clumsy, lowered toward the ground as if searching for comfort that wasn't there. He called out high-pitched, desperate sounds that carried across the empty plains. Nobody came back. For hours he stood in that same spot, calling into the silence. The scientific reality is cruel in its simplicity. An orphaned elephant calf without a herd has less than 48 hours to live. They cannot regulate their own body temperature. They don't know how to find water or which plants are safe to eat. Most critically, they lack the protection that only a herd can provide against lions, hyenas, and the African sun itself. As the day wore on, the calf's calls grew weaker. His small body cast an increasingly long shadow across the grass. In the distance, the herd he was born into continued their migration, their silhouettes growing smaller against the horizon until they disappeared entirely. The rejection was complete, the abandonment absolute. As darkness fell over the savanna, the temperature dropped rapidly. The calf's body, designed to be kept warm by proximity to his mother, and the herd began to lose heat at a dangerous rate. His skin, still tender and thin from his premature birth, offered little insulation against the cold African night. Predators moved through the darkness. A pair of hyenas caught his scent and circled at a distance, their eyes reflecting the moonlight as they assessed this vulnerable target. But something about the calf's stillness gave them pause. Perhaps they sensed that he was already too close to death to be worth the risk of a confrontation, or perhaps some instinct told them that this was a creature under observation by forces they couldn't see. Indeed, the ranger patrol that had spotted him during their afternoon sweep had not left him entirely alone. They maintained a distant watch through the night, their vehicle positioned far enough away to avoid disturbing him but close enough to intervene if predators approached. They had radioed the conservation headquarters, and the network of wildlife protection that Tom and Sarah Carter had helped build over 12 years was already mobilizing. The calf didn't know any of this. He knew only the cold, the hunger, the ache of muscles that had stood tensed for too many hours. He knew the absence of warmth and comfort. He knew, in whatever way a newborn elephant knows such things, that he had been deemed unworthy of survival. What the calf didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that 50 miles away, two people were about to receive a phone call that would change 3 lives forever. The morning mist still clung to the grasslands when Tom and Sarah Carter sat down for breakfast at their conservation camp. They had lived in Zimbabwe for 12 years, having left their lives in England behind to dedicate themselves to wildlife preservation. The decision to move had not been impulsive. Tom had worked as a veterinarian in rural England, treating livestock and household pets, feeling increasingly disconnected from work that had once felt meaningful. Sarah had been a teacher, spending her days in classrooms that felt smaller with each passing year. They had met at a fundraiser for African wildlife conservation, and the conversation that began that evening continued for months, then years, gradually shifting from, "Wouldn't it be amazing?" to, "Why aren't we doing this?" They sold their small house in the Cotswolds, liquidated savings, and applied to volunteer programs throughout southern Africa. The first 2 years were hard living, intense, working for subsistence wages, questioning their decision during every bout of malaria or equipment failure. But gradually they built expertise, earned trust from local communities, and secured positions with a conservation NGO managing protected lands in Zimbabwe. Their small brick house with its red-tiled roof had been built with their own hands over the course of 6 months using local materials and traditional building methods. It stood as a testament to their commitment. This was not a temporary adventure or a gap-year impulse. This was home. The house had become a familiar landmark to the local ranger teams who patrolled these protected lands, a place where they could stop for water, for first aid supplies, for Sarah's strong tea, and Tom's surprisingly good bread. The Carters had become part of the landscape, as much a fixture of this conservation area as the baobab trees and termite mounds. The phone call came at 6:30 in the morning. A ranger patrol had spotted the calf during their dawn sweep, a tiny gray form standing motionless in an open field, alone with no herd tracks anywhere in the surrounding area. The rangers estimated he had been there since the previous afternoon, which meant he was approaching the critical 24-hour mark. Tom set down his coffee cup with hands that had suddenly gone still. Sarah was already reaching for the truck keys before he finished explaining. They had worked with orphaned elephants before, but something about the urgency in the ranger's voice told them this was different. The drive took 40 minutes across rough terrain following GPS coordinates provided by the rangers. The landscape changed from grassland to scrubland and back again, the truck bouncing over ruts left by the seasonal rains. Neither Tom nor Sarah spoke much during the journey. They had responded to wildlife emergencies dozens of times over the years, but something about this call had left them both quiet and tense. They saw him from half a mile away, a small gray dot in an ocean of golden grass, utterly still, his trunk nearly touching the ground. Sarah's breath caught. Tom slowed the truck to a crawl, approaching carefully. The ranger vehicle was parked at a respectful distance. The lead ranger, a man named Tafara, who had worked these lands for 20 years, walked over to meet them. "No change," Tafara said quietly. "He has not moved since we found him at dawn. The herd tracks lead north. They passed through yesterday afternoon. He was left behind." Tom nodded, gathering equipment from the truck bed, veterinary supplies, blankets, bottles of electrolyte solution. Sarah moved ahead on foot, approaching the calf with slow, deliberate steps, her body language non-threatening, her voice soft and continuous. As they approached on foot, moving slowly to avoid startling him, the full reality became clear. He was so young that his skin still had the wrinkled appearance of a newborn, hanging in loose folds that would eventually fill out with muscle and fat if he survived long enough. His eyes, disproportionately large in his small face, were wet but held no fear. He was beyond fear now, too weak for anything except a kind of resigned stillness. His breathing was shallow, labored, his small rib cage visibly rising and falling with each difficult breath. The grass around him was trampled in a small circle, evidence that he had moved slightly during the night, perhaps pacing in confused distress before exhaustion forced him to stillness. There were no other tracks, no signs that any member of the herd had returned to check on him. Sarah knelt in the grass a few feet from him, making herself smaller, less threatening. The calf raised his head slightly, those enormous eyes meeting hers with an expression that seemed to carry too much awareness, too much understanding of his own abandonment. She had witnessed many heartbreaking scenes in her years of conservation work, poaching victims' animals caught in snares, ecosystems destroyed by drought. But something about this moment struck deeper. This wasn't just a wildlife crisis requiring intervention. This was a baby who had been left behind by everyone who should have protected him. This was rejection in its most primal form. Tom approached from the other side, assessing the calf's physical condition with a practiced eye. Severely dehydrated. Hypothermic despite the warming sun, malnourished. Without immediate intervention, he would not survive another night. They named him Kibo, the Swahili word for hope, during the drive back to the conservation camp. He lay in the back of the truck wrapped in blankets, his small head resting against Sarah's lap, too exhausted to be frightened by the vehicle's movement or the presence of humans. The transformation of their lives began the moment they carried him through the doorway of their brick house. The first photograph captured Kibo peering around the corner of that doorway, his trunk reaching forward with tentative curiosity. His ears spread wide as he processed this strange new environment. He looked impossibly small against the human-scaled architecture, a wild creature stepping into a domestic space, vulnerable and uncertain, yet somehow already beginning to trust. The care requirements were brutal and unrelenting. Elephant calves in the wild nurse every 30 minutes for the first months of life, receiving not just nutrition, but also antibodies, probiotics, and the specific fatty acids their developing brains require. Tom and Sarah developed a specialized formula based on research from elephant sanctuaries across Africa. A mixture of coconut milk, human infant formula, and carefully calculated supplements fortified with the vitamins and minerals Kibo desperately needed. They set alarms throughout the night, taking shifts so that one of them was always alert when feeding time arrived. The first week was the most dangerous. Kibo's digestive system rejected the formula, initially causing diarrhea that threatened to dehydrate him further. Tom spent 2 sleepless nights adjusting the mixture, trying different ratios, consulting via satellite phone with elephant care specialists in South Africa and Kenya. The breakthrough came on the 8th day when Kibo finally took a full bottle without digestive distress. Sarah cried with relief sitting on the floor of their living room at 3 in the morning, cradling the small elephant who had finally started to gain weight instead of losing it. Kibo cried when they left his sight. Not the loud trumpeting calls of an adult elephant, but softer sounds, whimpers and mews that seemed impossible to come from a creature who would one day weigh 6 tons. The sound cut through walls, through closed doors, through any attempt at normal household activity. Sarah discovered through trial and error that physical contact calmed him. If she sat on the floor beside him, letting him lean his head against her side, he would quiet. Sometimes she fell asleep that way, waking hours later with a cramped neck and a numb leg to find him still pressed against her, his breathing synchronized with hers, his small trunk draped across her lap. Tom spent the afternoons teaching Kibo to walk with greater confidence. In the wild, elephant calves learn by watching and mimicking their herd, thousands of hours of observation teaching them how to move, how to use their trunks, how to navigate different terrains. Kibo had no herd. So Tom became his model, walking slowly around the yard, while Kibo followed his steps, gradually growing steadier, his ears learning to angle forward for balance, his trunk learning to swing with each stride rather than drag uselessly on the ground. There were setbacks. Kibo developed an infection in his left front foot pad during the 2nd week, causing him to limp and refuse food. Tom treated it with antibiotics and daily foot soaks, sitting in the yard for hours, with Kibo's enormous foot in his lap, applying warm compresses while talking to the young elephant in a steady, soothing voice. There were small victories. The first time Kibo successfully used his trunk to pick up a piece of fruit and transfer it to his mouth, a skill that requires extraordinary coordination of 40,000 individual muscles. The first time he dozed off without needing physical contact, secure enough in his surroundings to sleep independently. The first time he approached Tom voluntarily for affection rather than food-seeking connection for its own sake. The household routines adjusted around Kibo's needs without discussion or resentment. Sarah's afternoon reading time moved from the indoor study to the front porch because Kibo liked to doze beside her chair while she turned pages. Tom's morning inspections of the property now included a small elephant trailing behind him, investigating everything with his increasingly dexterous trunk. Within 2 weeks, Kibo had learned that Tom's footsteps meant feeding time was approaching. Sarah's voice meant comfort and safety. The sound of their truck returning to the camp meant family was home. He would run to greet them, a loping, ungainly gallop that sent his ears flapping and his trunk waving. He learned to search Tom's pockets for the fruit treats hidden there. He discovered that if he stood very still beside Sarah while she worked at her desk, she would absently reach out to scratch behind his ears while reviewing reports. The bond that formed was not something they had planned or anticipated. It simply grew day by day, as natural and inevitable as Kibo's own growth. 3 months into Kibo's residence with the Carters, the local ranger team stopped asking when he would be transferred to an elephant sanctuary. They had watched the transformation not just of Kibo, but of Tom and Sarah as well. The couple moved through their days with the kind of attentiveness that only parents develop attuned to subtle changes in Kibo's behavior that might indicate discomfort or illness. Sarah could tell from across the yard if Kibo was genuinely playing or showing signs of anxiety. Tom knew the difference between Kibo's "I'm bored" rumble and his "I'm hungry" rumble without needing to look up from whatever task occupied his hands. Kibo, for his part, had developed an understanding of his human family that seemed to transcend typical animal-human relationships. Elephants possess remarkable emotional intelligence and memory traits that scientists have documented extensively through decades of field research. Their brains contain specialized spindle cells, the same structures associated with empathy, self-awareness, and complex social processing in humans and great apes. An elephant never forgets a kind act or a trauma. Their hippocampus, the brain region associated with memory formation, is proportionally larger than that of most other mammals. Their emotional bonds can last lifetimes, spanning decades, and sometimes outliving the humans they attach to. There are documented cases of elephants returning to the bones of deceased herd members years after death, touching the remains with their trunks in what researchers interpret as grief rituals. Kibo remembered being abandoned, even if he couldn't articulate that memory in human terms. The rangers who had found him reported that he had displayed signs of severe psychological distress in those first hours, the kind of trauma that in wild elephants can prevent proper social development even if the calf physically survives. Orphaned elephants who witness their mothers being killed by poachers often develop what researchers describe as species-level PTSD, exhibiting symptoms remarkably similar to human trauma responses. But Kibo also remembered being found, being carried in strong arms, being fed and warmed and comforted through those first terrifying nights in a world that had rejected him. Elephant memory works through association sense. Sounds, tactile sensations, all become woven into complex neural maps that persist for life. The scent of Tom's coffee in the morning became associated with safety and routine. The sound of Sarah's footsteps on the wooden porch meant comfort was approaching. The feel of their hands on his skin, gentle and consistent, built neural pathways of trust that grew stronger each day. The first time Kibo walked out into the yard alone, not following Tom or Sarah, but simply exploring on his own initiative, represented a watershed moment in his psychological recovery. For the first 3 weeks, he had refused to be more than a few feet from his human caretakers. The trauma of abandonment had made him clingy in ways that went beyond normal calf behavior. But on a clear morning in his 4th week with the Carters, something shifted. Kibo finished his breakfast bottle, stood up from his resting place beside Sarah's chair, and walked out into the yard. Not running, not distressed, just exploring. He investigated a butterfly that landed on a flowering bush. He used his trunk to turn over a small rock, examining the insects underneath with methodical curiosity. He tested his strength against a young tree, pushing gently with his forehead in a behavior that would in a few years become the powerful tree shaking that male elephants use to assert dominance. Tom and Sarah stood in the doorway watching. Neither spoke. Sarah's eyes were red, though she smiled. Tom cleared his throat several times, but said nothing. They understood what they were witnessing. A creature who had been too traumatized to take independent steps was now confident enough to venture out by himself, secure in the knowledge that his family would be there when he returned. And return he did after 20 minutes of exploration, trotting back to the porch with his ears flapping and his trunk swinging clearly, pleased with his own bravery. The local community began referring to Kibo as the Carter's boy. At first, it was said with gentle humor, foreign conservationists always doing things a bit differently. But as weeks became months, the tone shifted to something more respectful, even admiring. Visiting researchers would ask to see the elephant who lives with the Carters, as if this arrangement were as normal as keeping a dog or cat. In truth, it was unprecedented in this particular conservation area, not unheard of in elephant rehabilitation globally, but still remarkable in its intimacy and success. Other sanctuaries maintained more clinical boundaries, with calves housed in specialized facilities and human contact limited to feeding times and medical care. The Carters had not set out to blur those boundaries. It had simply become impossible not to once Kibo made his attachment clear. Attempting to maintain clinical distance would have been cruel to a creature already traumatized by abandonment. They made a choice consciously and together to prioritize Kibo's psychological well-being over professional protocols. The local village elders, whose knowledge of elephants came from generations of coexistence rather than Western scientific training, understood instinctively. They told Tom and Sarah stories of other orphaned elephants, some rejected like Kibo, others separated from herds by drought or predation. In traditional Shona culture, elephants were considered beings of great wisdom and memory. An elephant choosing to stay with humans was not seen as tragic, but as meaningful a bridge between species, a testament to the capacity for love beyond biological boundaries. The children from the nearby village became regular visitors, bringing Kibo fruits and vegetables from their family gardens. They would sit in a careful circle while Kibo investigated them with his trunk, learning to hold still, even when the unfamiliar sensation tickled. Sarah oversaw these interactions carefully, teaching the children proper elephant etiquette. No sudden movements, no loud noises, always approach from the front, where Kibo could see them coming. One child, a girl of about 8, named Tendai, seemed to have a particular affinity with Kibo. She would sing traditional songs in a clear, high voice, and Kibo would stand motionless, his ears spread wide, to catch every note. Sarah photographed them, once Tendai, with her hand on Kibo's trunk, both utterly at peace, the afternoon sun creating long shadows across the dusty yard. The ranger teams incorporated Kibo into their routine patrols, stopping by the Carter house to check on his progress, to share tea and stories. Tafara, the lead ranger who had been present at Kibo's rescue, brought his granddaughter to meet the young elephant. The girl was shy, hiding behind her grandfather's legs, until Kibo reached his trunk toward her with gentle curiosity. She touched it tentatively, then smiled, a moment of connection that transcended language and species. Tom and Sarah began the gradual process of introducing Kibo to other elephants in the broader conservation area. There was a small group of females with adolescent calves who showed tolerance for the young orphan. These supervised interactions were crucial. Kibo needed to learn elephant behaviors that humans couldn't teach him: how to use his trunk effectively for feeding, how to dust bathe properly, how to interpret the subtle body language and infrasonic communications that elephants use to coordinate group movements. Kibo engaged in these sessions with clear interest, playing with calves close to his age, learning from the patient matriarchs who seemed to recognize him as motherless and in need of guidance. But every afternoon, without fail, he would separate from the elephant group and make his way back to the brick house with the red roof. He would find Tom working in the garden or Sarah reviewing field reports on the porch, and he would settle beside them with a contentment that needed no translation. The most telling moment came during Sarah's illness. It was nothing serious, a flu that required several days of bed rest, but Kibo's reaction revealed the depth of his attachment. He stationed himself outside the bedroom door and refused to move. Tom tried to coax him away for walks for food for the scheduled interaction time with the other elephants. Kibo wouldn't budge. He stood there for 3 days, his trunk occasionally reaching under the door gap as if trying to confirm Sarah's presence. He dozed, standing up, ate only when Tom brought food directly to him and made soft rumbling sounds that seemed directed at the closed door. When Sarah finally emerged, still weak but recovering, Kibo examined her with his trunk touching her face, her hands, her shoulders, as if verifying that she was whole and well. Then he pressed his forehead against her stomach, a gesture of affection that elephants reserve for their closest family members. Tom photographed that moment. Sarah with her hand on Kibo's head, Kibo leaning into her with complete trust, both of them standing in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows of their home. The question came up frequently during visits from other conservationists, from journalists, from well-meaning friends back in England. Did they regret not having children of their own? Tom and Sarah were in their mid-40s now. The decision to move to Zimbabwe had effectively closed the door on traditional parenthood, the isolation, the demanding work, the financial constraints of conservation life. They had made their peace with that choice years ago. But watching Kibo grow, watching him overcome the trauma of rejection to become confident and affectionate and curious about the world, had reframed the question entirely. One evening, Tom sat on the porch steps while Kibo played in the yard, rolling in the dust and then spraying it over his back with his trunk. The young elephant had grown considerably, now weighing close to 500 pounds. His movements more coordinated, his personality more fully expressed. Tom reflected on the journey they had taken together, the sleepless nights during those first weeks, the anxiety every time Kibo showed signs of illness, the pride when he mastered a new skill or showed kindness to a smaller creature, the overwhelming love that came without effort or reservation. This was parenthood, even if it looked different from the conventional path. The species didn't matter. The biology didn't matter. What mattered was the commitment, the daily choice to put Kibo's needs above their own comfort, the willingness to let their lives be completely rearranged by the presence of this creature who needed them. Kibo looked up from his dust bath and made eye contact with Tom across the yard. His ears flapped forward an expression of happiness in elephant body language. Tom raised his hand in acknowledgement, and Kibo trotted over, leaving dusty footprints across the porch as he approached. The young elephant reached his trunk into Tom's shirt pocket, a learned behavior that usually yielded fruit. Tom laughed and produced an apple, which Kibo accepted with his trunk and transferred to his mouth with increasing dexterity. They sat together as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the Zimbabwe sky in shades of orange and gold. The grasslands stretched endlessly in all directions, the same plains where Kibo had once stood alone and abandoned, crying into the silence. But that Kibo no longer existed. The creature sitting beside Tom on the porch was loved, secure, and thriving. He had been rejected on the day of his birth, cast out by the very beings who should have protected him. Yet he had never stopped trusting. Even in those desperate hours alone, even in the confusion and fear of his first days with humans, some part of him had remained open to connection, willing to accept love from an unexpected source. That trust had changed everything. It had transformed two conservationists into parents. It had turned a brick house in the Zimbabwe wilderness into a home. It had proven that family is not defined by biology or species, but by the choice to show up for each other day after day in all the small and large ways that matter. Sarah joined Tom on the porch carrying 2 cups of tea. She settled into the chair beside him, reaching out to scratch Kibo's forehead. The young elephant rumbled contentedly, a sound that vibrated through the evening air like a purr. They sat together as a family, unconventional, unexpected, and absolutely complete. The rejection that had begun Kibo's life story had led him here to this porch, to these people, to a love that would sustain him for the rest of his days. In the language of elephant memory, which spans decades and transcends death, Kibo would carry the imprint of Tom and Sarah Carter forever. He had chosen them as surely as they had chosen him. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.